Hi guys, in this lesson I just want to cover off a bit of theory before we go ahead and create users and groups and roles in the Identity and Access Management service. So first you need to understand a bit of background on what it is. So as you know, you already created an account on AWS, and that was using an email address that you specified when you created your free tier account. Now that's known as the root account, and that account has complete privileges to your AWS account. So it's a very powerful user. In fact, it's very difficult to restrict the privileges of the root account. And therefore, it's an account which AWS recommend you don't use for everyday usage. Instead, you should create your own user accounts for yourself and for your employees and colleagues. The service that we use for that is known as the AWS Identity and Access Management service. And there's a few key components of this service that you need to understand. So the first is we have an IAM user. So this is an entity that represents a person or a service. So for example, if you have a number of employees in your company who are going to administer AWS, you may create an IAM user account for each of those employees. You can also use it for a service. So that means it's not used by an actual human being to log on with, but you use it for a service. The service uses the credentials of the account. Now, as you can see here, we can apply something called an IAM policy to a user. By the way, to make things a bit easier, we often call IAM IAM. So with IAM, you can apply what's known as a policy to a user, a group, or a role. Now, a policy is basically a document that specifies the permissions that you want to assign to that user. So, for example, you can create a policy that says, I want this user to be able to do X, Y, and Z. So maybe they're allowed to use the Amazon EC2 service. Maybe they're allowed to create other user accounts, that kind of thing. So you can specify with a lot of granularity what you want to allow your IAM user accounts to be able to do on AWS. Now, you can apply the policy directly to the user, but if you have a lot of users, that's going to very quickly become very complex to manage. So another way you can do it is you put your user into a group. So a group is essentially a container for collecting users. So you organize your users into groups. So maybe you have a team of developers and they all need similar permissions to AWS. So what you can do is create a group called developers, and then you put your developer user accounts into that group. You then create policies that provide the developers the permissions they need and apply the policy to the group. So now you've got one policy for a number of users rather than one policy per each user. So that's a much better way of managing the permissions associated with your users. And obviously you'd end up with probably lots of different groups in a big organization. Now, the last thing is we have something called a role. Now, a role is a little bit more complex to understand at this stage, but we'll see it in action very soon, and that will really help you to understand what it is. But think of this as something that can be used for delegation. So perhaps a service will assume the role and then get the permissions associated with the role. Now, an example of that is with the Amazon EC2 service. You can apply a role to Amazon EC2, and that will give it permissions to do things with other services on AWS. And we'll see that in action in the next section. Another concept that you need to understand is the different methods of authentication on AWS. So using the IAM service, there's a couple of different ways you can authenticate and get access to AWS services. The first one is what's known as an access key. An access key is composed of what's called an access key ID and a secret access key, and we'll see these in the console in the next lesson. You use an access key for accessing AWS via the API. So for instance, you can embed these into code, you can put them in a command line and use the command line to access AWS. So that's one method of authenticating to AWS and being able to manage resources. The other way is literally by managing through the AWS Management Console. What we did when we logged into the Management Console earlier in this section was to actually use the root account. But once you've got your IAM users set up, you'll log into AWS using your IAM user account. So it will be the name of the user account, the logon ID, and then a password that you can choose. And so that gives you access to the management console. So those are the two key ways. There is another way called a server signing certificate, but we're not going to look at that in this course. These are the two main ways that you're going to authenticate for most applications on AWS.